I'm deeply honored to have been asked to open this august occasion. When I saw the program and I saw the lineup, of course, my first reaction was, why me and why now? Anybody but me. Looking at this fantastic lineup of scholars, thinkers, activists whom I've admired and still do for a very long time. But I view this as a moment of divinity, a moment of divine purpose, a moment of messages that must be conveyed from the ones who have been to the ones who still are. And I speak in the name of the one who is and who was and who is to come. And I need to center myself in the language of my ancestors to say ke a leboha haholo ka sebaka sena hobaneng ke letsatsi le leholo haholo and e tlile ba fetileng ba na le rona, which briefly translates as those who have been are with us now. I want to open with a remark which says, to us over waters and mountains, hills, valleys, and plains, by waves, echoes, and air, these ministers of all times, the golden voice come carrying, quivering, and full of fire, that stainless spirit divine, never by time and pace tarnished. I speak to you today on March the 22nd from South Africa, soon to be called Azania, and we speak on the day of the Sharpeville Commemoration. And it is from this standpoint that I would like to make my remarks. And most of us will be aware that Sharpeville is a suburb outside, about 50 kilometers outside of Johannesburg, which gave the world an incredibly important moment. Some call it Human Rights Day, but we see it as the culling of 69 Black lives, African lives, which were led by Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe, who was an incendiary, a visionary leader in the anti-colonial, anti-imperial Pan-Africanist movement. And in order to reduce the possibility of violence at the time, he wrote a letter to the Sharpeville Police Commissioner announcing this upcoming protest and emphasizing that this protest would be non-violent. And accordingly, on March the 21st, about 7,000 African people gathered in front of the Sharpeville police station to protest against the restrictive pass laws. Nearly 300 police officers were deployed to put an end to this peaceful protest. And as they attempted to disperse the crowd, a police officer was knocked down, and then many in the crowd surged forward to assist or to see what had happened. At this moment, police opened fire and then began to then shoot live bullets, live ammunition. And what records show us historically was that 69 people were killed, 186 were wounded, and almost all of them were shot in the back. Now, the depth and weight of Sobukwe's voice is such that every known recording of his voice, his speeches, his articulations, his ideas, his imagination, his thoughts have been completely expunged by the settler colonial regime. And most regrettably, since 1994, his voice continues to be muted and muffled. And I want to suggest today that this is more than just a metaphor for the erasure of African histories across the world. It is a usurpation of those stories by white imperial entities and the erasure or the removal of Black bodies and the many inconveniences that they represent. It is important to note that the day of the Sharpeville massacre was not just a day. It was a day that was the culmination of centuries of Black people's non-humanity, displacement, spatial and geographical removal from the country of their birth and of their inheritance. In fact, this was a protest where the pass books, which were the identity cards, which were carried by every adult person in this country, it was actually an attempt to reframe and to reclaim Black personhood and Black humanity. It was also an affront to white settler imperialism and white capitalist extractivism. This extractivism actually monitored and in fact was the mediator between people's movements. It was the mediator between people's personhood, Black people's personhood, and their utility to industry, their utility to capital, their utility to production, their utility for the industrial apartheid complex, because that is what it was. Now, this actually gives us the opportunity to then think through the historical influence of Marxist and interpretations of South Africa's political economy after the crisis and what happened in the 1960s, but also the internationalization of struggle. There is much that can be gleaned and much resonance with the removal, the erasure, and the violence of Black bodies on that day, and the ongoing ontologies and the normalization of violences and erasure and removal of Black bodies and Black lives, even today, globally, amongst the global African family. The indignities are legion. And of course, the indignities of those days in 1961 in apartheid South Africa were such that people were forced and forcibly separated from their wives. Children above the age of 16 needed a special permit to live with their parents if they lived outside what were then called Bantustan reservations. And I'll say a bit more about the geography of white settlerism and the geography of white colonial racism in its ongoing forms later on. It also linked, of course, the utility of Black bodies, Black women and men to their ability to sell their labor to whoever they were chosen by or whoever they chose. So why is this horrific event of March 21st, 1960 considered as one of the major turning points of settler apartheid history and indeed of global Black liberation history? It's because it's a bold and fearless reclamation of African people's personhood, their humanity. It is an attempt to move us away from being working chattel, which was close to bonded labor, and domesticated enslavement, judicially enabled. And it goes to the roots of what imperialism actually is. It's a question of imperial power. And the roots of imperialism, colonialism across the world, and apartheid are really the roots of dispossessed people. And these don't just begin by coincidence in different isolated spaces. One of the most interesting things about South Africa is that it has given the world some of the best of worst practice. So the story of stolen land, the story of colonialism, the story of invasion and settler colonialism is one that resonates across the world. It resonates in the United States, it resonates in Brazil, it resonates in New Zealand, in Canada, it resonates in Australia. It even resonates in what is today called Zimbabwe. And the story of Black people who was dispossessed in the southern tip of Africa is also the story of the extractivist colonial logic of terra nullius, or empty land. And this is what has actually formed the buttress of racist invasion and human displacement. And this really is to do with the notion of culling African people, culling them through time and space, culling them as part of the colonial logic and as part of this capitalist means of production, which includes low pay and limited protection, which fuels race, gender, and class oppression. And indeed, racial capitalism ensures the depletion of other life forms and all forms of social, spiritual, and psychological degradation. And this is the same logic that keeps on informing the forced removal of Black bodies from spaces that are whitewashed in imperial imaginations. This is why it is an issue for somebody like George Floyd to be shot. This is why it's an issue for somebody like Andreas Tatani right here in South Africa to be shot. This is why it's an issue for somebody like Michael Adebayo, who was shot as a student in the US, to be removed from the imperial imagination. It's not as simple as walking while Black, talking while Black, breathing by Black. It is as simple as being annihilated for the sake of Blackness, because whiteness feels an inherent supremacy and feels itself as normative and all other identities as a disturbance, as a stain, and as a taint. Now, societies have endured for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they often disintegrate under the pressure of forced displacement. But settlers' colonialism is structural, ongoing. And as I say, it's based on the elimination of the native. So settler colonial logic is the one that means that there's a fundamental difference between settler colonialism and franchise colonialism. The former is based on elimination, and the latter is based on the exploitation of indigenous populations. One of the deepest toxicities about these forms of geospatial and psycho-emotional occupation are that they continue to prevail many, many hundreds of years after the originators have moved physically from the space. So we carry with us many of the ways and the means of othering, of instrumentalizing that othering, even between and amongst communities that are non-white. And the centrality of these settler colonial regimes means that even today, the notion of othering, the notion of these metropoles, whether it's in the US or it's in Australia or it's in Canada or it's in South Africa or it's in Mexico, seem to have been ignored by people who are working on issues of settler colonialism and linking and contemporizing them in this moment, in today, in the now. Now, I think one of the things as well that's useful to add here is what happens when we encounter the idea of space and the study of space and the violent collisions of space, because spaces have been conceptualized as neutral and as empty vessels in which some kind of abstracted political forces act on them. And this has led to many writings and thinking that political violence is simply to frame or to edit out the embodiment of violent spaces from their explanations. So this idea that space is interpretive is very dangerous because it suggests, in fact, that spaces are neutral and have no owner, or that there are certain bodies that have a preeminent right to occupy, certain bodies that have a preeminent right to occupy and to live and to reside and to thrive in public spaces. And again, the notion of the descendants and the ongoing forms of white settler colonialism have been informed by this logic of white supremacy. This is, of course, borne out by fees must fall. Why are Black children deigning to enter university spaces? Roads must fall across Oxford University, across Rhodes University here. Why are Black people offended by the ongoing image and the violent imagery, the violent spatial imagery of colonialists and imperialists staring down at them? And it also forgets that the concept of racial extractivism is a very important lens through which race, racism, and racialization, as well as colonialism, must be centered, because the story of Black Lives Matter, the story of apartheid, the story of settler colonialism are actually linked with the stories of extraction and nation state building. These nation states were constructed as predominantly white, and the imagination and the presence of Black people as extractive labor, and anything beyond that extractive labor as an infringement of those spaces. Cedric Robinson talks about the theorization of racial capitalism, racial extractivism, and he has contributed greatly to the studies of political economy and settler colonialism and cultural studies, and his utility is in analyzing the more regional specific context of contemporary discursive struggles and strategies, both domestically and internationally. But in the same way that Black deaths in custody are best understood rather as a feature, as a fundamental feature of settler colonialism in its ongoing formations, rather than a flaw or a tragic error of the justice system. This and parallel acts of destruction and desecration take place as part of an ongoing settler colonial project of Black people's displacement, whether it's cultural displacement, whether it's emotional displacement, whether it's spiritual displacement, whether it's displacement from land. It is in fact, it's an excuse, and often actively facilitated by overlapping agencies conjured up to open up land, to use the language of the frontier for the purpose of extractive exploitation, even more insurmountable and even more challenging when many of this extractivism is the extractivism of our minds, of our ideas, of our tongues, of our languages, of the way we look, and of our very souls. So to put this in a different way, when one doesn't recognize that the other can be different and as human as oneself, then one treats the other as less human or not human at all. One is not able to refuse or to understand that all represent different historical and cultural forms of belonging among humanity. So this ongoing dehumanization includes the process of the state of a colonized mind for white people who are living in their own racist society, frankly, of their own creation. Now, the problem of whiteness is that the overvaluation and the conditioning of white racial identity is explicitly enunciated in media, in popular culture, social vocabularies, political systems, economic models, multilateral power, and a myriad of other spaces. And the great majority of Black people ingest all of these images every single day. And the great majority of white people ingest the same. And in regard to so-called ethnic racial relations, if a person is not able to understand and recognize, and I speak specifically of white people, that others may have origins and may belong to different cultures, and in fact belong to cultures that predate their own, that to which they owe much of themselves, then one is not able to recognize that their own culture and their own cultural belonging and their own sense of inherency is not at all inherently better. Therefore, to be uncritically white, as Cardoso has said, in social relations only buttresses the notion and the ideology of what we now call white supremacy or white privilege. And the privilege of it is not being able to see it or being given the permission not to see, not to shift, not to perceive, in fact, and to assume the invisibility of whiteness. For me, of course, I think this principle also means looking at specific ongoing colonial ontologies and disrupting and subverting these, so that when we speak about anti-colonial practices, we are pushing back against colonizing institutions like the academy, to which many of us belong, to make space for indigenous resurgence, but not indigenous in a sense that fetishizes or others, but that in fact centers Black learning and Black knowledge. Although there are many colonizing practices to examine and to disrupt, I do suggest that a focus on control and power, extractivism, land exploitation, white supremacy, hierarchy, arrogance, abstraction, and individualism would be a good place to start, which is quite a shopping list. Another problem with whiteness is that it actually embodies a whole constellation of practices and beliefs, attitudes and emotions that are mixed up in being white. So whiteness is, in the words of the scholar Jensen, who is a white American researcher, he says that whiteness is degraded, it's depraved, it's this insane belief that one can find meaning in life simply by virtue of being on top of a racial hierarchy. To the degree that we accept any of the meaning that the dominant society gives to whiteness, we white people are degraded and depraved. And to the degree that those illusions of superiority linger in me, I am degraded and I am depraved, and I close quotes. Instead of race, the term that is now often employed is ethnicity in social science to describe groups and to describe individuals who share common characteristics that is anchored in social meaning. And ethnicity is often used when a group is distinguished from other groups of people, whether by religion, by history, by language, and by style. And this may be anthropologically accurate and acceptable, but I do believe that it runs the risk of depleting race of the very thing that's most important, which is color. People of color, non-color, become then indivisible and invisible. So people of color being the other and people of non-color, whoever they may or may not be, being indivisible from humanity and being invisible to oppression. Hence, Blackness remains an affront and offense to the mainstream, the normative, those who are of non-color. Call it Negro, call it Bantu, call it Native. Whatever we have been characterized as has always shown that we are an affront to the normative centrality of whiteness. And this is an essential conceptual problem and all that it represents. And to call it white privilege is to, in fact, minimize the weight, the power, the toxicity, the velocity of its capacity to shackle us, its pervasive influence, its pervasive omnipotent presence and in our lives. People like W.E. Du Bois and Nnamdi Azikiwe, George Padno, Michael Manley, Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Josina Machel, Ransom Kuti, and so many others have sought to universalize the idea that the Westphalian order that prioritized the nation state is the central articulation of sovereignty and its self-determination. And yet remember that these nation states that we have inherited, particularly in the global south, are nation states that share the toxicities of the colonial experience. These are the nation states that were in fact intended to vacate us, we the people, we the Black, brown people, the owners of these states. And now we try to sanitize and we expect that in some way they will be less hostile to us. Every time I watch leaders going to the African Union, I'm reminded once again that even though Kwame Nkrumah's and others' sentiments and Julius Nyerere and other people who I love and admire, their sentiments were great, but what they were inheriting were essentially states that were dead on arrival because they were birthed in colonial imaginations, which I don't believe we have had either the courage, the means, or the resources, or perhaps the analytical power to be able to reconfigure and to confront head on. So I would also argue that these leaders actually refigured decolonization, perhaps as a radical rupture of that time, but they also sought to remake the international order through the substantive redistribution of legislative and economic power using the same frame as this Westphalian model. And I'd like to suggest here that this unequal and inegalitarian international order has never truly welcomed us, nor has it welcomed Black people and the Black family, either on the continent or in the diaspora. So the anti-colonial nationalism as an imperial project that harnessed national independence to the transformation of international society should have been in the image of the majority of people of this globe who are in fact non-white or people of non-color, but it is not. So when we speak about the whole notion of white privilege in countries of the global north, racism is at the heart of this. And of course, the legacies of the transatlantic trafficking of African bodies, European colonialism of African countries and beyond is actually at front and center of understanding the antecedents of the struggles of Black people today. Because in fact, chattel slavery, colonization were viewed not only as normal and desirable, but even generous in their day. The whole notion of civilizing of white superiors, the whole notion of Christianity being Christianized or in some cases Islamized as well. And I say this as no disrespect to anybody's faith tradition. These are also my faith traditions. But indeed, it is hard to move away from this discursive link between the notion of imperialism, the notion of trying to civilize others, and the notion of trying to make them pray in a particular way, eat in a particular way, dress in a particular way, and most importantly, to disappear them from their own spaces. This continues across Europe and across the global north because the whole notion of why Black lives are not desirable is because they have come to understand we as people have long begun to dislocate ourselves from the notion of being seen in white people's imagination, whether as chattel, whether as workers, whether as sub-citizens, whether as those who are so grateful to make it off the boat into these spaces, whether that's to the Americans or whether that is to Europe in different ways. And the fact that now there are cries about reparation and restitution for the sufferings of all of the many hundred years of unmitigated violence, of forced removals. And I think I would like to locate the notion of forced removals of African bodies from the African continent as part of the discourse of terra nullius, of emptying out this land. Colonial administrators and security forces and commodity traders and the judiciary and businesses, all of these entities have a role to play and have questions to answer. So again, when we now contemporize this and think through, for example, that the legacies that did not disappear in so-called post-colonies, and perhaps we should say in post-independent states, or in the Black diaspora, the lower expectations of Black children in schools, the reluctance to view Black people as worthy of senior appointments, the violence meted out on Black women and men across the world. And this includes by states which are run by African people, unfortunately. And the lines of the hand that suggest strongly that the accounts of Black experiences today in nations of the global North should be understood in the context of the global South, because past relationships with Black people of Africa, our evolution, our reconfiguration, and our resonance and legacies in societies today. Subaltern status for Black people continues, although it might be different in post-independent states, but also for the Black diaspora in much of the global North. So we don't have to stop right there. We can continue with the notion, in fact, that a quote from one of our very well-known clerics in this country, who also mentioned the notion of Western philosophy and that theology, imago Dei, which means made in the image and likeness of God, which of course was this ontological conception of whiteness as being proper. And he says in response to how the Black church, for example, and Black liberation theology, to which I also owe some of my thinking and my ideological framing through my parents. He says here, the Black church rejected the anemic, inadequate theology of accommodation and acquiescence, of individualistic, otherworldly spirituality foisted upon us by Western Christianity that taught us to accept the existing unjust order as God ordained. We embraced, rather, what we called a theology of refusal, a theology that refused to accept God as a God of oppression, but rather a God of liberation, who calls people to participate actively in the struggle for justice and liberation. So in this regard, whiteness then was refused the authority to refuse its soul, to infuse its soul into Black bodies. It is a refusal of our souls into whiteness, into the souls of Black bodies that was cemented by the ideology that Black bodies didn't actually have a soul and still do not have a soul, and thus can be subjected to any form of subjugation, can thus be subjected to any form of incarceration, can thus be subjected to any form of removal and erasure, can thus be subjected to any form of humiliation and brutalization. So in other words, this was a refusal for Black bodies to remain the other, absent even from ourselves, while their presence came into being through the infusing of soul of whiteness. And remember the old, very hubristic quote by, which says, "I think, therefore I am." And this is really an imaging and a centering of whiteness, that whiteness is the thought process and the imagining of whiteness is what gives Black people life. I'd like to move to Blackness and geography and quote, of course, the great geographer Catherine McKittrick, who says, who wrote in Demonic Grounds, that Black lives are necessarily geographic, but they also struggle with discourses that erase and despatialize their sense of place. So from the analysis of the diaspora to the plantation, to Robben Island, to Kenya, to Nigeria, to Brazil, to Australia, to Belgium, to France, to the UK, to the United States, to anywhere. The studies of urban segregation, to anti-colonial circuits of resistance, Black thought has always been concerned with questions of space and of place and of power. And this brings me back neatly to exactly where I began, the notion that the Sharpeville massacre was a contestation of space and of place and of power. Now, these interventions span centuries, she continues, and continents, but they've not always been recognized properly as geographical, and thus have been systematically excluded from the formal canon of disciplinary geography. I think that it's almost impossible to speak of colonialization of Black people, white imperialism, without speaking about geography as a site of struggle and space as a site of struggle. Within the last few years, she says, Black geographies as a field of inquiry have gained recognition through the tireless work and the tireless labor of Black scholars. So this subjection of African descendants, not only through spatial geography and spatial oppression, which is mitigated and which is manifested in all the ways in which we are placed in different, in our own little Bantustans. So the Bantustans, which we call here townships, places, of course, everybody has heard of Soweto, but of course it's but one of many townships, Guguletu, Davidson, Tembisa, many others, Kwamashu, which was very well known in the 1990s, and KwaZulu-Natal. You could say the same about Compton in the US, Brixton, Peckham, my Peckham, where I grew up, and different places, the spaces and places, the favelas of Brazil, the places where people and people of African descent are located and taken. The concentration camps, if one can put it that way, of imperialism, of land dispossession, of depression, of unequal wages, and the denial of basic rights, the denial of collective bargaining, for example. So this, of course, then gives rise to the anti-Blackness and the super-exploitation, which has intensified in character. So while anti-colonial nationalists have also asserted a political economy of self-determination that in fact requires an internationalization of struggle, internationalization of social solidarity, and the internationalization of these sorts of struggles to remedy centuries of super-exploitation, super-extractivism, super-imperialism wrought by domination, in excavating the imbrication of imperialism, race capitalism, and this super exploitation, we are led to a space where the imperial world requires not only political freedom, but economic redistribution, the democratization of wealth, and working class and women's liberation as well. None of this is adequately captured by the term white privilege, but we can begin to take this as a standpoint and as a lift-off point for much deeper analytical analysis. It's almost impossible for me to get through a talk without saying something around the feminist approach to states. And I want to then again link this into the notion of Black women's bodies as being neglected actually in this moment of consideration to a great extent. We often see the figure of the martyrdom across Black liberation struggles as the men. It's Patrice Lumumba, it's Steve Biko, it's Mangaliso Sobukwe, it's Kwame Nkrumah, it's Martin Luther King, it's Che Guevara, it's Malcolm X, my man Malcolm X. It's all of these people, and yet we forget that there are many women, and there are many women whose bodies have been equally sacrificed at the altar altar of liberation movements. I also want to suggest that because these men, per se, good men that they may have been, were not per se thinking about the state in a nuanced way and thinking about the notion of feminist citizenship and women's citizenship in particular ways. This collusion of patriarchal ideas and, of course, imperial colonial ideas means that the impacts of patriarchy and gender and inequality and sexual exploitation have then been reenacted and reignited and recontracted within the states that we live in, whether it's on the continent or whether it's in the diaspora. I have a contention and hypothesis that states everywhere really are not interested in women, especially non-white women. I think that Karen is the normative, Karen, Amy, whatever she may be called, is the normative center of consideration. This notion of the white woman's fragility as being the normative form of womanhood. So this then privileges white women over Black and brown women. It also questions the idea of universal solidarity in women's movements and in liberation movements, which then problematizes and complicates the national question, the liberation question, and the anti-colonial question as well. So social inequality must be situated in relation to racial, ethnic, and sexual privilege. So, for example, in this instance, the sovereignty of states as we have constructed them, and as I still contend many of our founding fathers, and I guess maybe founding mothers, failed to challenge or didn't challenge sufficiently, is the multiple ways in which political groups and social groups want to be recognized as fully fledged states within the authority of existing states. I'm not sure that that level of demarcation is a luxury that we have, but I do want us to understand, I would appreciate our understanding on the notion that women's oppression within this really convoluted linear of imperialism, of colonialism, of settler apartheid, of settlerism in all of its forms, of the slave trade, is as being co-opted as cultural and national symbols, as being reproducers of the state. The states in their counterinsurgency have always called up the emancipation of women on the agenda, but they've done absolutely nothing to deconstruct the colonial relations and the imperial relations that keep women in a particular space. And I think as a Black woman and as an African woman, I must speak very loudly for the subjugated and ongoing subjugated state of African women and Black women in particular. As a penultimate point, I want to just talk about the state of the state. And as I've already said, in relation to global inequality, post-colonialism actually has given us the opportunity to better understand how global class relations emerge and how we have to address these ideas. So the imposition, the colonized have come to believe that they're the culturally inferior others. And this internalization makes it much easier for colonizers to justify and maintain their rule. And let's remember that colonization is not only happening in Asia. It's certainly not only happening on the African continent. It's happening everywhere. It's happening in France, it's happening in the US, it's happening in the UK. And we talk of, Boris Johnson, colonizer in chief, Donald Trump, colonizer in chief, Emmanuel Macron, colonizer in chief. And just because they may not have geographical spaces under their jurisdiction does not in any way excuse them from the legacy of colonialism. And we should be very careful not to be blindsided by these strange binaries and these deflecting mechanisms. I'd like to conclude then by suggesting an ethic of restoration and recognition. So the notion of Black people as non-human, subhuman, not centered and not normative to the invisible people of non-color means that we need to recognize and restore the autonomy of Black people, including indigenous nations, however we may then construct them. And that's a core element of this repair. Autonomy is central to the notion of who being human is. It's essential to the notion of dignity, because dignity is both carried within the individual, it is also relational, because people then confer it upon each other through recognition, through recognizing, through seeing the personhood of those who they exist with. I don't know how many times I've said to somebody, some white person in the line who thought they could jump in front of me, do you not see me? Am I invisible to you? So the notion of seeing is a powerful political reclamation and of being seen, whether we and however we demand it. So this imperial logic, of course, is dependent on not seeing and not recognizing, whether it's not recognizing the land issue, whether it's not recognizing reparations, whether it's not recognizing social redistribution, whether it's not recognizing cultural contributions, whether it's not recognizing the inequity of the carceral states, whether it's not recognizing the contributions historically that have been made and continue to be made by Black people across the world, whether it's not recognizing through this toxic notion of terra nullius, the empty land, the assumption that the natives are non-human, therefore not entitled to be seen and recognized. And this is, of course, the primary justification for occupying Black identities, loving the Black without the Black. So being seen as human, including an individual, a being, through the acknowledgement of ourselves first, is central to the notion of who is and who's not seen as human. The mass atrocities and the colonizations and the multiple ways in which Black lives continue to be brutalized must then be seen in the context, of course, of these ancient civilizational contradictions, of the ways in which cultures and knowledges have been taken, in the ways in which we reframe these philosophies and resources, both tangible and intangible. And there's a role to be played by non-state actors, including multinational companies and their extractive role in capitalist extraction, particularly of non-white labor, of Black labor across the world, whether it's migrant workers, whether it is the low-paid jobs that most people, Black people, are shoved into, particularly those of migrant status and so forth. But this notion, of course, that we have to preserve and we have to rethink who we are is the call, the rallying call that I would suggest today. I want to close with a poem that was written, again, in dedication of this great prophet whose voice is still without sound, but I'm privileged that we are able to give him sound even today. And he was known as the defier of the undefiable. And I'm going to pick it up exactly from there, where it is said, that made you the defier of the undefiable. Call with that magic voice that to us wonders revealed by leaving stark naked the evil, arrogance, and myth upon which white supremacy rests. Call and tire not, direct and rest assured. For you we stand and fall, daily toiling and sweating, bleeding and dying until freedom is won. As we say in my culture, the land is ours and we shall be free. Thank you.